The dominant narrative that everyone talks about is as if AI is a being. It's like, where is that being? It's a bunch of servers. It's a bunch of matrix multiplication. Why do you feel such a need to view AI as something that is going to be your leader, or something that is going to rule you, or something that is going to be separate from you and control you? Why do you not see it as a reflection of yourself? It's never just a mechanism for summing these disparate beliefs into a singular place where it can try to do some type of mediation between the differences. Start with this foundation of generative models. They are basically modeling collective belief, or whatever goes into the model. We can take a second step, which is where we add these citizen or source embeddings, which ensures that each individual voice only has a fixed size box to speak through, and they can speak through it as much as they want, but they're never going to have more space than anybody else. So that keeps a sort of evenly weighted sort of representation of collective belief. And then we can introduce into that model belief over time and sort of the expectations about what certain actions being taken at scale will do to the world, and then what actually happens. And we can then upweight certain voices more than others. Hi, my name is John Ash. I am an AI engineer. I've worked primarily with natural language models for about a decade now. I used to work at a large fintech company where my job was mostly focused on bank transactions. There's a little string of text that's associated with each transaction that describes what the transaction was, but that string is pretty noisy and inconsistent. So my job was to make sense of the meaning of transactions and what that money was essentially used for in a broader context of the account. And I was recently on YouTube and I saw a video from David Shapiro about AGI for governance. And I clicked on it right away because AI in conjunction with human decision making is something that I've been interested in for a very long time. And so I thought I might see in that content at least some of the ideas that I had come across in this time. Unfortunately, not once in this almost hour of talking did he make the connection that AI, generative AI specifically itself, is a democratic mechanism. He only ever framed it as if it was some sort of leader or integrated being or representative itself, something that was meant to supplant the role of humans directly, and not that it was a higher resolution form of voting, right? Which kind of astounded me. Like, I thought that if you had this much experience talking about AI, exploring all of these new technologies, that it would not be that hard for you to make the connection or the analogy that when you're training a generative model, that you're capturing a distribution of collective belief. And I understand kind of why most people do not make that connection. Most of us have our exposure to what AI is through movies and stories, and because those aren't really based off of any understanding of machine learning itself, it's usually anthropomorphized. Like, we see signal in the noise. There's some sort of apophenia, and we see the pattern of ourselves in it, rather than seeing it being this representation of collective intelligence all summed together. But to me, when you look at any generative model, if you go back to something like a generative adversarial network, that's trying to just model faces, that hasn't taken all of the art into it, it's never going to output anything from that isn't a face. It's by definition like a pooling mechanism that tries to create a representation of the input where you can, whatever you output looks like whatever you input. And so to me, that very clearly is a type of polling. It's a high resolution form of sampling from a data set where the output is sort of like a summary of the input. And I kind of see this in the global narrative of what AI is, to the point that it kind of confuses me that there has been no breakthrough on this narrative that AI doesn't need to be an integrated agent. It doesn't need to be a being. It instead can be a reflection of wider beliefs about complex issues and what we would like to see happen in the future or happen in the present, and what has happened in the past relative to our, past voted beliefs. I mean, I say voted in quotes because to me, it's relatively clear that what AI enables is that you are no longer bound to the concept of voting. Even people like Ilya from OpenAI, who is like one of the top level of people, when he talks about governance, when he talks about, he has this idea that AGI would be some sort of CEO and that humanity is the board members.
The ideal world I'd like to imagine is one where humanity are like the board members of a company where the AGI is the CEO. The picture which I would imagine is you have some kind of different entities, different countries or cities, and the people that live there vote for what the AGI that represents them should do. And an AGI that represents them goes and does it. And you could have multiple AGI. You would have an AGI for a city, for a country, and they would be trying to, in effect, take the democratic process to the next level.
He's still talking about votes, right? And I just don't understand why you would not think about this in the context of everybody just writes what they believe in. They write what they think should happen, what they think has happened, what they think is happening, and you keep record of that. And the model is continuously trying to model that collective belief. Okay? In the David Shapiro video, there's a brief section, which maybe I'll play next, maybe not, that talks about the need for it to somehow collect the will of the people.
The first thing that we need to do is use AI, whether it's a combination of existing, machines and databases and stuff, combined with large language models, combined with deep multimodal models. We need to survey the will of the people. Whatever else is true, one of the chief purposes of government is to reflect the will of the people. Now, right now, the primary way we have to do that is through voting. That is the primary mechanism that we have to express our will, where it's, every so often we get to go pick a person who we feel represents our desires and beliefs, and then we go and hire them via election to go represent our desires, our values, our beliefs in the process of government. But if you remove all humans, then it's not necessarily electing a representative. You have to express your will some other way. Now, that doesn't mean that you get rid of voting. Maybe you have more voting. But this goes back to Socrates' complaint, which, and I know Elon Musk is one of the people who said, oh, direct democracy makes sense. It absolutely doesn't. You do not want to live in a direct democracy, because then you have tyranny of the majority, and that can get real bad real fast. However, by combining existing online platforms, leveraging new technologies, using large language models and semantic clustering and all sorts of stuff, I suspect that we could easily build a platform, a democratic platform, that very, very comprehensively collects and understands the will of the people. And then what do you do with that information? We can figure that out later. But rather than just picking a person, because also remember, go back to the slide that I did about fundamental human flaws, power seeking, avarice, plain old ignorance. You get rid of those if you get rid of people. Now you introduce new problems if you replace people with machines. But the point is that if we can directly express our willpower through some mechanism, maybe with a combination of blockchain voting and artificial intelligence and a few other things, then the machine apparatus of government will at least be aware of what we, the people, want. So that's step one. We need something that allows us to express our will and allows it to be recorded and accurately measured, so that then the AI government can then use that.
And even in that moment, he does not make this connection that the training data itself already is doing that. It's already collecting the will of the people with all of its warts and all of its niceties, with all of the human shadow and all of the human light. And the problem that we run into with the basic model of transformers, where we're just predicting the next token, is because there is just so much in there and there's so much conflict in human belief that it doesn't really consistently behave the way that we want it to. So we need a process of steering the outputs to be a little bit more focused and a little bit more weighted towards some representation that is deemed as good, right? We need to have something like reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is training a reward model where you have people rank or vote upon a number of responses to a particular prompt and say which one is the best. And then you create this model which can be rapidly trained against the original model to update the parameters to try to create outputs that consistently align with what is being modeled as the right answer by this reward model. And in that process, there inherently is a weighting or an upweighting of particular voices in that process. And so perhaps maybe it is in that zone that other AI engineers are not making this connection, that what it is a democratic mechanism, because they're stepping away from the idea of it being a perfect representation. But I don't think that if we want a functional form of hyper-democracy or a functional form of governance that involves AI, that we want a perfect representation. We can start with that. And in fact, I think that maybe if you're watching this, you're wondering, well, how do you ensure that the sort of equivalence of votes, if different people can just say more things and be overweighted in the model, be like if it's predicting the next token and if one particular voice is 50% of the tokens, it's going to lean towards that voice more. And I don't particularly think that's a hard problem to solve. There is something in language models called word embeddings, and for each and every word, they are allocated the same amount of weights to model their meaning. Right? No particular word is given more space to store their meaning, right? And on the same tack, if you were to have something like a citizen embedding, where each individual voice is tied to a particular identifier, then they could speak as much as they want into that space. It would be like everybody has a box to speak through, and they could speak as much as they want, and they could get as a high resolution copy of their beliefs in as much nuance as possible. But if they don't want to, they can just say as little as they want to, and the gaps will be filled in by the other voices who basically say very, very similar things. So you could essentially have a democratic mechanism that would allow for people to speak their truth at any particular time in any particular way, and the only thing that the model is really doing is representing that belief. I think this is, and I've thought this for a very long time, that this is the incredibly obvious future of collective decision making. But at every turn that I look, none of you seem to get it. Like, I'm a little confused why you can't understand it. It's not that complex, but the dominant narrative that everyone talks about is as if AI is a being, as if it's this one thing. It's like, where is that being? It's a bunch of servers. It's a bunch of matrix multiplication. And it's not doing much more than trying to predict the next token. And it's never really, when you're working with smaller models and you're only inputting one particular type of data, stepping outside of that bounds. You know, if it's a generative model, like I said, trained on faces, it's only going to output faces. I think the problem is the scale of human knowledge is just so large, and it's so difficult for us to fathom it, that we have trouble realizing that, yeah, anything that you see out of the model is somewhat represented in the training set. Like, I heard Asa Raskin and Tristan Harris on Joe Rogan show giving an example of it doing something that it wasn't explicitly trained to do, and that was like doing chemistry. I'm like, but people talk about chemistry online. That is in the training set, right? There is always something in the training set about or related to what is output. We have yet to see these models, for example, output brand new languages that are completely consistent. I mean, sure, maybe you could give it a prompt that says, you know, make a new language, but it probably only would be as complex as a simple cipher where individual words map to other representations of those words. It wouldn't invent its own grammar. It wouldn't invent its own syntax. And I just want to ask all of you if you get this and what you're thinking about right now. Why do you feel such a need to view AI as something that is going to be your leader, or something that is going to rule you, or something that is going to be separate from you and control you? Why do you not see it as a reflection of yourself? I know that there is no process that OpenAI or these other companies are affording you to basically put your own words into that training set. They're limiting your capacity to create GPT models through something like RAG, where there's some sort of vector-based document search to introduce your meaning into the context window whenever it gives you a response. And not very many people are doing the sort of fine-tuned models that has sort of a LoRa matrix where your additional meaning is stored in a subset or smaller subset of parameters. Not a lot of people are doing that, but it exists. I mean, and it works very well, and it can capture new meaning that is outside of the current Overton window of belief. It's kind of hard because it needs to have a sort of place to plug in, right? It's like if my knowledge or my belief set is like this Lego, it can kind of have a hard time fitting in to that larger built out representation unless I explicitly make that bridge. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very clear that it doesn't model anything outside of its representation. Just how much I have to repeat and draw the lines very clearly to my representation or understanding of the world. For me to get it to do things or talk about the ideas that I work with which, many people who watch my channel know that I'm a proponent of a concept called cognism, which is basically this, which is using AI to model collective belief. And there's sort of a attention market within that, whereby the model is learning over time which voices to attend to more in certain contexts, such that when it outputs useful information to people, it's only citing and it's only sourcing from the people who have a clear history of getting it right. I mean, I think you could think about this as like a doctor, for example. If a doctor is consistently making predictions about their patients, they're making diagnoses and basically saying, if you take this medication, if you do this treatment, you will get better. Well, I don't want to listen to a doctor who consistently gets it wrong, right? I want there to be some sort of distributed weighting where the doctor who is always getting it right is sampled more, right? And in governance, I don't want people who write legislation that doesn't lead to the intended outcome to be uplifted again. I don't think they should write legislation if they continue to write legislation that doesn't achieve what it sets out to achieve. Instead, you want to say, okay, this person made this set of guidelines and they worked. Okay, they seem to get something about the world and how it functions, and so therefore we should upweight that person. And that's sort of going beyond the notion of a democratic mechanism, because a democratic mechanism is supposed to be this evenly weighted mechanism where you only have one vote, and everybody is supposed to only have one vote. A market dynamic, it functions such that you can earn more voting power by earning more money or capital. And when you have more access to resources, you have a greater impact upon the market and how it functions. So what I'm saying is that we can start with this foundation of, all right, generative models, they are basically modeling collective belief or whatever goes into the model. We can take a second step, which is where we add these citizen or source embeddings, which ensures that each individual voice only has a fixed size box to speak through, and they can speak through it as much as they want, but they're never going to have more space than anybody else. So that keeps a sort of evenly weighted sort of representation of collective belief. And then we can introduce into that model belief over time and sort of the expectations about what certain actions being taken at scale will do to the world, and then what actually happens. And we can then upweight certain voices more than others. And all of those parts together form what I call cognism. The model that does this is called an iris. We talk about taking those learned representations and those staked beliefs that are guiding the collective decision-making process and writing them to a blockchain. Like, that has already had a large amount of work done in a different context to sort of secure that which we don't want to see modified. And this is a similar sort of case where if what you're saying in the past affects your future influence on the decision-making process, obviously people would want to retroactively change what they had said in the past. So you need to have some place that you can store it securely. And we call that the semantic ledger. But all of these terms are just me trying to give boxes or pointers so that you can make sense of it, right? That you can see the parts and you can see how they fit together. But I'm kind of struggling in the sense that if there is a person out there who is making hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of AI content, and they're talking about AI for governance for an entire hour, and not a single time they make the connection that AI itself, generative AI specifically, is a democratic process. It's a democratic mechanism that is only ever representing the things that go in. And I feel confident enough to say that, and I think you should also feel confident enough to say that, because if you simply take out anything from the training data about physics, or take out anything about a particular book, right? It will never talk about that. It's never going to spontaneously recreate a book that hasn't yet been written, like something that has yet to gone into that training set. It has to be in the training set for it to talk about it at all. And maybe this is going too far to the edge of what you want to hear about, but even things like Fun Search, which I think DeepMind released recently, which was claiming that that there was an AI model that was making new discoveries, it still had a target by which it could evaluate success. It was a particular math problem set. I don't remember the name of it, but it was something where you could directly test success. And so therefore it could rapidly iterate and check whether its ideas work, right? And at every single step along the way, you get a clear feedback signal that says, oh, we either are succeeding or we are not succeeding. It's the same concept behind AlphaGo, which is a form of self-play. But in the game Go, when you're doing self-play, the win state is very, very clear, right? Because large language models don't have access to the real world directly, they only have access to, what we say about the real world. It only ever is modeling a belief space itself. It's only ever modeling what we think about the world. And it's going to reinforce the peak of the Overton window. It's going to reinforce things that might actually be wrong, right? And it's going to push back against things on the edges, which actually might be people ahead of the curve who actually know a little bit better about the world, who understand the world in a better place, because the models that we use to represent the reality and the models that we use to make predictions about reality, they're constantly evolving themselves. And sometimes we have to let go of things that made pretty good predictions for things that make a lot better predictions. Sometimes we have, models of the solar system that make pretty good predictions about where the planets are going to be, but they require a lot of complexity and nested loops to be able to make those predictions. And then you have a new model of the solar system, and that model makes a lot better predictions with a lot less math. And so we let go of those old beliefs. We need to have that mechanism in AI. And until we realize and until we collectively embrace the narrative that this is more of a democratic process, that it is being steered by corporations in a very non-democratic way, I think that we're going to still face a lot of existential risk, and we're going to expose ourselves to more and more apophenia, more and more seeing of patterns in the noise, to a very insane degree, because there's so many collected artifacts of our output online that, it can very much model our behavior online. It probably will not be an integrated being with an experience of reality because it's not embedded in time. It's not embedded in the world. It's embedded in belief space. And the only thing that it's seeking to do is predict the next token or create outputs that look like the inputs. And to me, tell me if I'm wrong, that is not a being. That is not an agent. That is just a process of polling or tallying where there is an ability to do math upon meaning, right? We had this insight with word embeddings that you could do a type of math with representations of meaning, where you would have something like king minus man equals queen minus woman. There is some analogous representation in the vector space where you could do that type of operation. To now we can do that with a lot greater nuance, where each and every voice is afforded the capacity to speak their truth and to have it have real resolution weight that affects the collective decision-making process. But maybe the people in power just don't want you to have that. Maybe the people at OpenAI know this is possible and they just don't want to give you that power. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it's just we're trapped in these narratives that have been made by Hollywood, or whether there is a true understanding that this is a democratic mechanism and there's no effort to push that narrative, because it would mean essentially that every output is a distributed sampling of the input. And if every output is a distributed sampling of the input, you're basically doing remixing. And so you're sort of laundering plagiarism when it comes to art models, when it comes to the language output. Because every time you write something, every time you create something through the model, it's only ever because it's pulling from a real person. And if it's pulling from a real person, that means you're doing a modification of an original input. So they don't want there to be an understanding behind the model of the source that belief came from. But I think that could basically revolutionize the way that we make decisions together and have it reflect our needs better. So that if you are suffering in your local community, if you're suffering in your life in some way, you don't have to struggle so much to speak to your representative and expect them to never listen to you. Instead, all you have to do is just write your beliefs. And because attention within the model is a function of just energy itself, it can and will attend to your words as long as you're allowed to, pass them through the model. So I hope this made sense. I hope this was illuminating to a number of you about how we could use generative models to do a higher resolution form of democracy. And I hope some of you have some answers to my questions about why the collective narrative is refusing to amplify or talk about this frame, and only ever wants to talk about this in the concept of, well, it's the CEO of the board where humanity is the board members. It's the president or the king, or it is the representative. It's never just a mechanism for summing these disparate beliefs into a singular place where it can try to do some type of mediation between the differences. It can embody and embrace the fact that people have different beliefs and try to create and learn a representation over time that can draw pathways between these different sets of beliefs. If, Democrats are this hill of belief and Republicans are this hill of belief, how do you over time trace a pathway to help them connect and see each other, right? For the real human beings that they are, and the real cares and concerns that they have, which are often usually very, very similar, but we just don't spend enough time interacting for us to see eye to eye. And maybe if we just take a moment to reframe, we can reinvent the world for the better. Thank you. Thank you for listening.